I'm Brian English, forum name Hyperbytes, and in this module we're going to be looking at the making of the wappler-all-in-one-ai extension, which I recently published. I'm not going to do this, literally typing every command in, etc., end to end, because that would make for a very long and very boring video. But what I'm going to do is going to take you on a walkthrough through how it works, how it was developed, and the techniques that were used. There's actually nothing new that you're going to learn in terms of techniques here. What you are going to see is how all of the techniques that are previously taught are pulled together and used to make a more interactive and user-friendly experience. So for those of you who haven't looked at it, let's just have a look at the multi-AI extension. Here we are. So this is the multi-AI extension. You have a question to ask the AI. You can specify the maximum number of tokens which will be expended on the inquiry. Remember, tokens includes not just your response but also your question. Temperature is about whether something is more analytical or more creative in terms of reply, and that changes between different AI setups. And then we have the AI service itself and the engines within that. So if we look at here, defaulted to ChatGPT, ChatGPT 4 Mini, you can see we can select 3.5 Turbo or the old flat ChatGPT 4. And you'll see there it gives you the range to which ChatGPT temperature can be set. If we now go down to Claude, you'll see now we have the different Claude engines that are available. And you also notice that this prompt has changed because, of course, Claude uses a range of 0 through to 1, not through to 2, which is different to ChatGPT and also different to Gemini, which also has a range of 0 to 2. And again, we can see Gemini engines. So as you see, as we change the different drop down, we get the different engines. And then lastly, we have dynamic. Dynamic is where you actually dynamically input the engine itself. And we do that just by a comma separated pair engine taken from these three suggestions here, and then the service and then the engine that you're using. And there isn't an awful lot of error checking on that, so make sure you get it right or you're just going to throw an error. So effectively what we have is this top end here remains fairly static, but the bottom end changes depending on the selection. And if we actually look at a page that I put together, you'll see that we effectively have this image here, the top part, but we have 4 different variations of it. We have the ChatGPT version, we have the Claude version, we have the Gemini version, and then we have the dynamic version. And I suppose the sort of complexity, shall we say, of this module is in all of those hide shows, which allows the different sections to be hidden or shown context dependent on which AI engine we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop over to the Hjson here, and I'll keep referring back to this image as we go through, and we'll look to see how this Hjson is built. So we start with a fairly simple type, module, and action, as we've seen before. We've created a new group called AI modules, and we've used a group icon of a brain symbol, and then we've got the title of the individual module, and again its icon, which I've also used the brain for. I'll only be doing this in Node because PHP support for most of the AI engines is fairly sketchy. We're going to allow that the full name element to be pickable, and then we have a data scheme, and that is the result from the AI query, but I'm also going to echo back the service, the engine, the maximum tokens and the temperature back as a reply, just so that if you need to store that at all in any records, you have that available to you. Not strictly necessary, but really useful to have, I think. We have the used modules that are covered in, I think, the last module, module 15. And we see Anthropic, we see Google Generative AI and OpenAI, which are the NPM modules that we are using for GPT, Gemini and Claude. So that's nothing unusual for you. You've seen that all before. We now go into the inputs. We obviously have the name input, the mandatory one. And I've defaulted that to a base name of multi-AI1. So that is the name that will be allocated when you first open it up, which is this input here. We then have the my question. That's a question that you're going to be sending to your AI itself. So you'll see there, it's straightforward text input. And again, that is this here that we see the AI question. We then have the max tokens and the temperature. Again, these are just text inputs. As I've explained before, we really never use the number input in our extensions, purely because it's very limiting. It doesn't allow any pickers, and text or number and string, I think, is the alternative, are perfectly adequate for what we need. I've defaulted to 30 tokens just to keep it small, keep the costs down, and I've set a default value of 0.5 for the temperature, which means it tends towards a more analytical result by default. We now have three pretty well identical prompts. First one is a general prompt. That is a temperature info prompt. That just tells you that low temperature is for more analytical and high temperature is for creative. I'm just going to pop a line in there to make it more readable. We then have three. We have a GPT prompt, we have the Claude prompt, and we have the Gemini prompt. And that is simply because ChatGPT range 0 to 2, Claude 0 to 1, Gemini 0 to 2. Now we could have just got two prompts there, but I thought it would probably be easier for readability if ever you come back to it to understand that those are basically AI service dependent. So here's our AI service that we select from a drop down, and we see, just ignoring all the hides and shows for the minute, that we have ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini and Dynamic. And that is what we'll see when we drop these items down here. We then have a lot of hide and shows. And what we're basically saying here is that we're going to show the appropriate engine and the prompt. Engine and prompt being, this is the prompt, the ChatGPT temperature range, and this is the service. So we're going to toggle that message and the engine based on the selection of the AI service. And yeah, it gets a bit heavy, and that's why I thought it was important to do this graphically for you. So you can see, for instance, we're going to have ChatGPT. We want to show the GPT engine and the GPT prompt. We want to hide everything from Gemini and Claude and Dynamic service. We do the same for Claude. If we have the Claude selected, we show the Claude engine and the Claude prompt, and we hide everything from Gemini, GPT and Dynamic. Again, Gemini, we show Gemini engine, Gemini prompt, hide all the GPT, Claude and Dynamic stuff. And lastly, obviously, if we select Dynamic, we show the Dynamic. Three sections here: the service, external message and external message 2. And if we go into Dynamic now, you'll see there are indeed two messages. Services are GPT, Gemini, Claude, and then specify service comma engine, i.e. GPT, comma GPT 3.5 turbo, separated by, and it says a colon. I'll have to change that in the code because that is actually now a comma. I made a last minute design decision last minute. I missed that message there. So we'll actually do that as we go through. So having set this up, we've got initial value. I'm defaulting just to GPT, and then we finally get to here. I've noticed Wappler's quite forgiving in terms of missing commas between these sections. Just as an aside, I do occasionally miss them. I haven't noticed it causing any problems, but it's obviously better to do it properly. And now we have to define our different engines. So here we have our Claude engine defined first, called Claude engine. It's a drop list. It lists the 3 engines that are available. It sets an initial value, so 3.5 Sonnet is initially displayed. But notice we have initial display none, and that means this input will not display until it is displayed through a show action. We do exactly the same with our Gemini engine. We've got our Gemini engines. Again, we're just not displaying it at all. GPT engine, drop list, our GPT services, our initial value for mini. Again, display none. And then lastly, we do the same with the dynamic service. But this time, obviously, we don't have a drop down because that is a one-off. What we do is that we just display an input box if it's dynamic. Notice again, initial display none. We've got the 2 external messages that we looked at before, and again, they are display set to none. And then we finally have the output. So if we remember what we talked about there and look at the interactivity here, we select GPT. That says show the GPT engine, show the GPT message. We select Claude. That says show the Claude message, the Claude engine, but hide the rest. Gemini, again, show the Gemini options, hide the rest. And so that interactively hides and shows those inputs as you need them to ensure that you only see the ones that you need to be seen. And then lastly, we have the dynamic, obviously, where we have the dynamic engine service, and we would put in something like GPT, GPT 40 mini. Again, if you're not quite sure what those are, if you just have a look in the original forum post, you'll see that those are listed. The beauty is if they bring out that should be a 40, but never mind. If they brought out a 5, provided there wasn't a change in the code base, you could actually override things and just say 5. Say 5 if they call it 5.0. And that way you could actually use a service which has not yet been integrated into this all-in-one module as soon as it's launched, and then obviously hopefully I would have added it in at a later date for you. So it does allow you. It's also some of the legacy engines that are still out there and still active. If you want to use one of those legacy engines, you can specify it by doing it in this way. So that's basically how we build the Hjson. That was a bit of a whistle stop tour through it, but hopefully that will give you an idea how to use it. But say the big thing in this lesson is how to use init display none to stop our inputs showing, and then to have our inputs interactively changed as we select items from a drop-down list, and we select what needs to be shown and what needs to be hide. And we can really manipulate every element of that input interface by doing that. So next, let's just have a quick look at the JS side of things and just show how that we decode all of that. Okay, so now I've got the JS there. So we start with the usual exports and the name. That's a name obviously that we've set within our Hjson right at the top here, multi-AI. We'll set our global imports. And obviously, if you're importing this from NPM, these will be installed for you manually. So we got the Anthropic definition, the Gemini, the GPT. And then we process our question. Now, if you remember, the input is called my question within the JSON itself. So here, my question, name is my question. And we take that, it's required input. Obviously, it's no point in sending anything to an AI if you're not actually asking it anything. So we're passing options my question. I'm just set it to be accept any data type. And if that isn't sent, it will simply output an error, no question sent. We then have the max tokens and temperature here and here. And we pass them. And I'm going to pass them as optional and then give them an optional default. So we'll pass it. If there's nothing set there, it'll default it to 50. And similarly with temperature, it will pass the temperature sent. If there's nothing there, then for any reason, then it will set it to 0.5. Just to make sure people haven't added anything silly in, we do a temperature to maths abs temperature. In other words, if we put a negative value in, we'll just toggle that to a positive value. And then what we'll do is we'll pass which AI service. So again, if we go to the JSON, just to remind you, this is our AI service. So whether we're selecting GPT, Claude, Gemini, or Dynamic, and we pass that, and that obviously is required. We need to have some sort of service specified. Otherwise, it's going to output now or no AI service selected. Now we do a little bit of logic here. First bit of logic really of the lot. We say var engine. And what we're doing is we're declaring which engine we're going to be using depending on the AI service. So know the AI service is either GPT, Gemini, Claude, or Dynamic. We simply use a bit of a ternary operator. The engine is, if it's GPT, options GPT engine. What's options GPT engine? That is these options here. In other words, it's the GPT engines. And we do the same for the rest. If the AI service is Gemini, we get the Gemini options. If it's Claude, we get the Claude options. Otherwise, we're just going to say the engine is dynamic. So that then basically means that the engine that we have is set to whichever option has been returned here. So if we want ChatGPT, the engine setting that we have here in this line will be whatever engine has been selected here. You can probably see why I did want to type every bit of this as we go through. You would have lost the will to live by now, I think. So we know the engine now. We know the service. We know the engine. We've got the temperature. We've got the tokens. We've got the question. The only thing we need to do now is deal with what happens if it's dynamic. And if it's dynamic, we're going to say, well, let's pass that dynamic input. Required, obviously, otherwise we'll throw an error. And because it's comma separated, we're just going to split that input, dynamic AI, on that comma to provide two parts. And the first part will be the service, and the second part will be the engine. Probably a little bit more followable, shall we say, if I actually put those the other way around. So we split that comma separated value, GPT, comma, GPT 3.50, etc., into its two parts. So the service, that means that when we get to this part, which is where the work is done, we know a number of things. The AI service will either be GPT, Gemini, Claude, or Dynamic. The engine that's going to be used within them will be set within the variable engine. And we obviously know we've got our temperature, we've got our max tokens, and we've got our question. So We're then going to just use a simple switch on AI service, and we're going to process it depending on which service has been set. We need to just correct the temperature. We know we've got a positive value because we took its abs value up here. So down here, because we know the GPT is between 0 and 2, then we're just going to say if it's more than 2, let's truncate it to 2, otherwise use the actual temperature. And then this is the simple code that we're going to do. We get our API key from our settings within workflows. I'm not going to show you that because I've got live settings in, but if you remember in your workflows here, if you go into environment, you'll be able to see all of your variables, and it's listed within the forum post which variables need to be set. And then the actual running of it is incredibly easy. This is straight from ChatGPT's website. Basically, we say that we simply create our call to GPT here, and then return the result. Simple enough. And then lastly, in line with the schema, we say we're returning result, service, engine, max tokens, and temperature. Doing exactly the same with Gemini, but this time we're temperature limiting to 1 as opposed to 2. We're getting our key from there, and then exactly the same. We're just using this code here straight from the Gemini website to call that and returning our result. Lastly, Claude, doing exactly the same again. Claude, maximum 2, so we clip it to 2. We get our key, and then we just make the simple Anthropic call, and all these calls to the various AIs are handled by the NPMs that have been installed through this. So they really do all the hard work. This is really just an interface between Wappler and those NPMs. So it's really, really simple. And of course, don't forget, we don't actually need to deal with dynamic. Why do we not need to dynamic? Because basically we have defined our AI service and our engine here. So this switch statement will deal with all of those cases where the service has been set to either the GPT, Gemini, or Claude, and the engine has been set. So by declaring it all and processing it all before we go into this processing area, then we have the inputs. We don't need to deal with dynamics separately at all. So basically that is the making of all AI. I would suggest, if you're really interested, you have a look at the files. I'll attach the appropriate files to this post so you can have a look in detail and how that works. And I hope that once you have a look, you realize that these extensions are not difficult. And if we're using existing NPMs to interface with services, that makes it, the building of them, incredibly simple. We just have a look at all AI in action. Here's our module here. Let's first of all have a look and see what ChatGPT GPT-4 Mini, the new one, can make with what is wappler-all-in-one-ai in just 50 tokens. So let's run that. Sorry, better save it first. And there we are. I'll just forward that up. We see that ChatGPT-4 Mini has returned this reply. Let's just try that with Claude. Run it again. And there's Claude's reply. Slightly different, as you would expect. Let's go into Gemini. Run that. Now Gemini tends to, I think this is Markdown language that it puts into it. I really should research that. But it does tend to throw the asterisks in with great liberal abandon. And then lastly, if we look at dynamic, and I'm just going to use 3.5 turbo. Oops, a little spelling mistake here. Just for information, if you don't specify something that fits for service or engine, it's just going to throw an error. So let's fire that up, and there we are. You see, it's got that from the fact that it needs to use GPT, and it's used GPT 3.5 turbo, and it has returned your data. So there you are. That's the making of all-in-one AI. I probably will be adding some more services to that in the future, but for the moment, that's the initial release. So take a dip into the code, which I'll attach if you have time, and work through it. It'll probably be a help, and all I can say is thank you for joining me again. Goodbye.